Arthur pulled his old sedan into the employee lot behind the glass tower, just after 5 in the morning, the engine sputtering once before it died. He sat there for a second, rubbing his eyes, then turned to look at the small figure buckled into the back seat. "Okay, buddy. Today's a quiet day, remember? You stay in the room with your tablet, and Daddy comes to check on you every little while." 6-year-old Leo nodded, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit against his chest. "I won't make a sound. I promise." The babysitter had canceled at 11 the night before, some family emergency she hadn't bothered to explain, and Arthur hadn't had a single soul left to call. No family nearby, no money for a last-minute sitter, and a job he couldn't afford to lose. So here they were, sneaking into a building worth more than every dollar Arthur had ever earned in his life, hoping nobody would notice one extra small shadow trailing behind the maintenance cart. He badged them both in through the service entrance, the fluorescent lights of the underground corridor humming overhead. Leo's sneakers squeaked against the polished concrete, and Arthur winced at the sound, glancing around before hurrying him along. They passed the loading dock where 2 other maintenance workers were unloading crates, and Arthur nodded a quiet greeting, angling his body slightly so Leo stayed tucked behind the cart, out of sight. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever really looked twice at the maintenance staff, which was usually exactly how Arthur preferred it. Today, for once, that invisibility felt less like a comfort and more like a tightrope he was walking without a net. "Remember the rules?" he murmured as they reached the service elevator. "Stay quiet, stay in the room, don't touch anything," Leo recited dutifully, like he'd memorized it in the car. "That's my boy." Arthur pressed the button, and the old elevator groaned to life around them, carrying them down into the belly of the building where the real work happened, far from the marble and gold upstairs. The utility room was small and gray, lined with mop buckets and cleaning supplies, but Arthur had set up a little nest for his son in the corner. A folded blanket, a granola bar, a juice box, and a tablet loaded with cartoons. "This is your office for the day," he said, forcing a grin. "Very important job. Guard the mops." Leo giggled. "Yes, sir." Arthur kissed the top of his son's head, grabbed his cart, and stepped back out into the hallway, already rehearsing the excuse he'd give if anyone asked why he looked so exhausted. He'd been running on fumes for weeks. Ever since his wife passed, it had just been the 2 of them, and some days the weight of it sat on his chest like a stone he couldn't put down. But he never let Leo see that weight. Never once. Upstairs, in the vast marble lobby of Holloway Tower, a very different kind of morning was unfolding. "This is not acceptable." Eleanor Holloway's voice cracked through the cavernous space like a whip, and every assistant, coordinator, and executive within earshot straightened as if physically struck. "I asked for ivory linens. These are eggshell. Do you understand the difference? Because I'm beginning to think none of you do." The events coordinator, a young woman clutching a tablet with trembling hands, stammered an apology. "Save it," Eleanor snapped, already turning away, her heels striking the marble like gunfire. "Fix it before the gala tonight, or don't bother showing up tomorrow. Half the board and every major shareholder in this city will be standing in this room in 12 hours, and I will not have them thinking Holloway Technologies can't manage a tablecloth." She swept through the lobby like a storm system with a personal assistant trailing 2 steps behind, barking notes about seating charts, lighting temperature, and the exact placement of the crystal centerpiece that had just been delivered, a towering, one-of-a-kind sculpture commissioned specifically to sit at the heart of the room, a physical symbol, she liked to say, of everything Holloway Technologies had built. Eleanor Holloway had clawed her way up from nothing, and she never let anyone forget the climb had made her hard. Somewhere along the way, hardness had curdled into cruelty, and she'd stopped noticing the difference. To her, the people who cleaned the floors and carried the boxes were scenery, furniture that occasionally needed correcting. She hadn't always been this way, or so she told herself in the rare, quiet moments she allowed herself to think about it. There had been a version of Eleanor once who worked the phones herself, who slept on an air mattress in the office because she couldn't afford an apartment, who understood, on some buried and half-forgotten level, what it felt like to be looked down on. But that version of her had nearly drowned along with the company 7 years ago, And the woman who had crawled out of that wreckage had made herself a promise. Never again would she be the one standing at the bottom looking up. She had rebuilt herself with a kind of scorched earth ambition. And somewhere in the rebuilding, she had convinced herself that cruelty was simply the price of strength, that if she stopped pushing everyone beneath her, she might slip back into that air mattress, that fear, that powerlessness. She never once considered that the ghost investor who'd saved her all those years ago might be standing 3 feet away from her on any given afternoon, mop in hand. Today, of all days, there was no room for softness. The gala tonight would be broadcast, photographed, dissected by every trade publication in the industry. Investors who had once doubted Holloway Technologies' staying power would be watching to see whether the company that clawed its way back from the edge of collapse had truly become something permanent, something untouchable. Eleanor intended to give them exactly that impression, down to the last thread count on the tablecloths. Back in the utility room, boredom had already begun to win its quiet war against a 6-year-old's patience. The tablet's battery blinked red, then died entirely, and Leo sat in the dim light for a while, swinging his legs, before deciding that guarding mops was, in fact, the least exciting job in the world. He cracked the door open. The hallway outside was empty, and past it, through a set of tall glass doors, he could see something that made his eyes go wide. A room full of glittering lights, towering flower arrangements, and, right in the center of it all, something that sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars caught in glass. He forgot his promise the second his feet started moving. Leo wandered into the main hall in his socks, mouth open, spinning slowly to take in the chandeliers, the gold-trimmed chairs, the shimmering drapery. He'd never seen anything like it. It looked like a castle. It looked like magic, the kind of magic he only ever saw in the cartoons on his tablet. And here was real, glowing softly under lights that seemed to have been placed just for him. He walked slowly along the edge of the room, careful not to touch anything, remembering his promise even as his curiosity tugged at him harder with every step. And right in front of him, waist-high, perched on a slender white pedestal, was the most beautiful thing in the entire room. A sculpture of crystal shard arranged like a blooming flower, catching the light and scattering it across the walls in tiny rainbows. Leo had never seen colors move like that before, dancing across the marble floor like they were alive. He crouched down to watch a little rainbow slide over his own sneaker, laughing quietly to himself, forgetting entirely about mops and tablets and utility rooms. He reached out one small hand, not to grab it, just to touch the light dancing across its surface. His shoulder brushed the pedestal. It wobbled once, twice, and then it tipped, and the sculpture that had cost more than most people's houses shattered against the marble floor in an explosion of glittering shards, the sound echoing through the hall like a gunshot. Eleanor rounded the corner at that exact moment. Mid-sentence, phone still pressed to her ear. She stopped dead. For one full second, there was only silence. Leo, standing frozen amid the wreckage, glass glittering around his socked feet, his small face crumpling as the shock gave way to terror. Then Eleanor screamed. She dropped her phone and crossed the room in 4 furious strides, seizing Leo by the arm hard enough to make him cry out, yanking him away from the glass. "What did you do? Do you have any idea? Do you have any idea what that cost?" Her voice had climbed into something shrill and unhinged, drawing heads from every direction. "Whose child is this? Where is your mother? Where is anyone?" She shook his arm with each question, and Leo's crying turned into full sobs, his small body shaking. "Is nobody watching you? What are you, some kind of street rat that just wandering off the sidewalk?" Arthur heard the scream from 2 floors up through the stairwell door he'd propped open, and something in his chest turned to ice before his mind had even finished processing what he'd heard. He didn't remember deciding to run. He just found himself sprinting, cart abandoned, taking the stairs 2 at a time, his own pulse roaring in his ears louder than anything else. He burst into the main hall and saw his son's arm in a stranger's grip, saw the terror on Leo's face, and every rational thought evaporated. "Let go of him." Arthur's voice came out rougher than he intended, and he was already moving, sliding between Eleanor and Leo, pulling his son against his chest, shielding him with his own body. He dropped to a crouch, one hand cupping the back of Leo's head, murmuring rushed and broken reassurances into his hair while his heart hammered against his ribs. Only then did he lift his eyes to the woman standing over them, glass crunching under her heels, her face contorted with fury. "I am so sorry," Arthur said quickly, standing, keeping Leo tucked behind his leg. "He wasn't supposed to leave the room. I take full responsibility. I'll pay for it, whatever it costs. I'll work it off. Extra shifts, weekends, whatever you need. You'll pay for it." Eleanor let out a short, humorless laugh, looking him up and down, the faded uniform, the scuffed boots, the exhaustion carved into his face. "With what exactly? Do you have any concept of what that sculpture was worth?" "It was one of a kind. It was commissioned. It cannot be replaced by a mop-and-bucket salary." "Please," Arthur said, and he hated how small his voice sounded, hated the way his pride folded itself up and disappeared the moment his son's safety was on the line. "It was an accident. He's 6. He just wanted to see the lights." He could feel Leo trembling against his leg, small fists gripping the fabric of his pants, and every protective instinct in Arthur's body screamed at him to simply pick his son up and walk out the door, insurance and rent and everything else be damned. But he learned a long time ago that pride was a luxury poor men couldn't always afford. So he swallowed his and kept talking, kept apologizing, kept offering anything he thought might soften the woman standing in front of him. "I'll cover the cost from every paycheck until it's paid off. Years, if that's what it takes. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking for the chance to make it right." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he hated that too. An accident. Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the small crowd of executives that had begun gathering at the edges of the room, drawn by the commotion, phones lowering, conversations dying. She seemed to notice them all at once, and something in her posture changed, straightened, sharpened, like a performer stepping into a spotlight. "Everyone, come look at this," she called out, gesturing broadly at Arthur and Leo as if presenting an exhibit. A dozen executives drifted closer, uncertain, exchanging glances. This is what happens when standards slip. This man's job, his one job, was to be invisible, to keep this building running, and instead his child is running loose through a private event destroying six-figure property. She turned back to Arthur, voice dripping with contempt. "This is a perfect lesson for all of you. Incompetence doesn't just cost money. It costs everything because people like this," she gestured at Arthur's worn boots, his frayed collar, "people who can't manage their own lives, can't manage a child, can't manage a simple job, they drag everyone around them down too. This is what the bottom of the barrel looks like." A ripple of uncomfortable silence moved through the small crowd. A few executives shifted their weight, glancing at each other, clearly uncomfortable, but discomfort had never once translated into action in a room where Eleanor Holloway held court. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody ever did. Arthur felt his face burn, felt Leo's small fingers tighten around the fabric of his pant leg, and he swallowed the response rising in his throat, because losing this job meant losing everything. The health insurance, the rent, the only stability he had left to offer his son. He had spent years training himself not to react to moments exactly like this one, had built an entire second self whose only purpose was absorbing indignity, so the version of him that mattered, the father, the protector, never had to. That trained self stood very still now, hands loose at his sides, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Eleanor's shoulder, and waited for the humiliation to run its course the way a man waits out a storm. "You're fired," Eleanor said flatly, as if she were commenting on the weather. "Effective immediately. Don't bother collecting anything from your locker. Security will box it and mail it to whatever address you're currently squatting in." A few of the executives exchanged uneasy glances, someone near the back murmuring that perhaps this had gone far enough. But the murmur died the second Eleanor's eyes swept toward it. "Ms. Holloway, please." In this, Eleanor's eyes dropped to Leo, and something colder entered her expression, something that made Arthur's blood run hot with a different kind of fear. This is honestly a matter for someone else entirely. A man who sneaks his child into a corporate building, leaves him unsupervised to destroy property. Dressed like that. She gestured again at Arthur's clothes, at the hole worn into the knee of his work pants. A man clearly living in poverty with no support system, no babysitter, no plan. That's not a home. That's neglect. She was already pulling her phone from her blazer pocket, thumb hovering over the screen. I think Child Protective Services would have a great deal to say about a man who can't provide better than this for his son. The words landed like a physical blow. Arthur felt something inside him go very quiet and very still, the way the air goes still in the seconds before a storm breaks. He thought of every sacrifice that had brought them to this exact moment. The second job he'd worked in secret for a year after his wife passed, the nights he'd gone without dinner so Leo could have seconds, the birthday parties he'd thrown out of dollar store decorations, and sheer stubborn love, because he refused to let his son feel the absence of money as an absence of joy. None of that mattered to the woman in front of him. To her, a torn pant leg and a tired face were the whole of the story. He'd absorbed the insults about his job, his clothes, his station in life. He'd swallowed all of it, because his own pride was a small, disposable thing next to his son's well-being. But this, the threat aimed at the one thing he had built his entire existence around protecting. This was different. The fear drained out of his eyes, and something else moved in behind it, cold and absolute. His shoulders, which had been curved inward in apology for the better part of a decade, straightened. Slowly, deliberately. The posture of a man who had spent years making himself smaller, so he wouldn't threaten anyone, wouldn't draw attention, wouldn't be seen. Gone. He crouched down in front of Leo, blocking Eleanor from view, and spoke in a voice so gentle it seemed impossible it belonged to the same man. Hey, look at me, bud. You did nothing wrong. You hear me? Go wait by the elevators. Count the little lights on the ceiling until I come get you. Can you do that for me? Leo, tear-streaked and trembling, nodded and scurried off toward the elevator bank, casting one frightened glance back over his shoulder. Only when his son was safely out of earshot did Arthur turn back around. The change in him was immediate and total. Eleanor, phone still raised, faltered mid-motion, some animal instinct flickering behind her irritation as she registered the shift in the man standing in front of her. The way his eyes had gone flat and unreadable, the way the air in the room seemed to have dropped several degrees. Put the phone down, Arthur said. His voice was quiet, quieter than her screaming had been, and somehow it silenced the room more completely than any amount of shouting could have. Excuse me? Eleanor's laugh came out thinner this time, less certain. I said put the phone down. He took one step toward her. Just one. But something in that single step made her retreat a matching distance, heel catching against a shard of broken crystal. Security, she called out, though her voice had lost its earlier command. Someone get security. This man is threatening. A guard, young and uncertain, began moving forward from the perimeter of the crowd, one hand hovering near his radio. Arthur didn't even look at him. Stand down, Marcus. The guard froze mid-step, eyes widening, because Arthur had never once, in 3 years of quiet, invisible maintenance work, spoken his name aloud, let alone with that particular tone. Flat, absolute, unmistakably the voice of someone used to being obeyed rather than obeying. How do you? The guard started. Blackthorn, Arthur said, and the single word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. The color drained from Eleanor's face. It was a name buried 7 layers deep in confidential legal filings, a code word attached to the most sensitive clause in Halloway Technologies' founding contracts, known to perhaps 4 people on the entire planet. The company's original attorney, Eleanor herself, her late father who had signed the original paperwork, and the anonymous party on the other side of that signature. A party whose identity had been so thoroughly protected that even Eleanor had spent years wondering if the man even still existed. That's impossible, she said, and for the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, Eleanor Halloway's voice shook. Arthur closed the remaining distance between them, unhurried, each footstep landing with quiet finality against the marble, until Eleanor's back met the cool surface of the boardroom wall behind her, nowhere left to retreat. 7 years ago, Arthur said, "Your father's company was 6 weeks from bankruptcy. Payroll bounced twice. Your investors had pulled out. You were about to lose everything your father spent his life building, and there was exactly one anonymous offer on the table. Full recapitalization in exchange for silent equity and permanent licensing rights over a piece of proprietary architecture that, as it turned out, became the backbone of every product this company has shipped since." He paused, close enough now that Eleanor had to tilt her head back to keep meeting his eyes. "You've spent 7 years building an empire on top of code and capital that belonged to a man you've never met. A man you just called a street rat's father in front of your entire board. That's no. No, that investor was..." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed. "There's no way. He was a ghost. Nobody ever confirmed." "Hey, Pendleton," Arthur said quietly. "Arthur Pendleton. I dropped the last name a long time ago. Easier to disappear that way." The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere behind him, Arthur was aware of the small crowd of executives frozen mid-breath, of the young security guard standing utterly still, of Eleanor's own assistant staring at him as though he'd materialized out of thin air. He reached into his back pocket and produced a wallet so worn the leather had gone soft and gray at the corners, and from deep inside a cracked interior pocket, he withdrew a folded document, creased from years of careful handling, the paper gone thin and yellow at the edges. He unfolded it slowly and held it up, not close enough for her to snatch, just close enough for her to read the header, the signatures, the raised notary seal still faintly visible. "The original agreement," he said, "unredacted. Every clause your lawyers thought had been sealed and buried is right here in my pocket, where it's been for 7 years. He let that settle before continuing. "Including the clause your father insisted on, over my objections, because he said he wanted a safeguard in case the company ever fell into the wrong hands." Section 14. If the leadership of Holloway Technologies is found to have engaged in what the contract terms moral bankruptcy, a pattern of conduct so far removed from basic human decency that it threatens the integrity of the company's reputation and mission, the silent partner retains the right to revoke all licensing rights, effective immediately, no board approval required, no appeal process available. "You wouldn't." Eleanor's voice had dropped to something close to a whisper, all the venom burned out of it, replaced by something rawer and far more frightened. "Everything, the algorithms, the architecture, the entire platform, that's built on my work," Arthur finished for her. "Yes, please." The word seemed to cost her something enormous to say. This woman who had built an entire identity around never once asking for anything. There are thousands of employees. Their jobs, their families. "I know." Arthur's expression didn't soften, exactly, but something in it shifted, some flicker of the weight he was choosing to carry. "That's the only reason I've spent 30 seconds considering doing this quietly instead of just walking out that door and letting my lawyers handle the rest by morning." He glanced back once toward the elevator bank, where he could just make out Leo's small shape sitting cross-legged on the floor, dutifully counting ceiling lights. "But you didn't threaten the company 30 seconds ago. You threatened my son. You put your hands on him. You looked at everything I've sacrificed to raise him, every extra shift, every meal I skipped, so he wouldn't have to, every night I sat up doing this job, so I could keep my head down and give him a normal life, and you called it neglect. You called us garbage in front of a room full of people, because a set of clothes told you everything you thought you needed to know about my worth." He turned to address the small, silent crowd of executives who hadn't moved a muscle through the entire exchange. "I built the foundation this company stands on because I believe in your father's vision and because I wanted no part of the spotlight that came with it," Arthur said, his voice carrying easily across the marble hall. "I have watched, quietly, for 7 years, as that vision curdled into whatever this has become. Effective this moment, in accordance with Section 14 of the founding agreement between myself and Holloway Technologies, I am formally revoking all licensing rights to the proprietary architecture underlying this company's core platform." He folded the document carefully and slid it back into his wallet. "My legal team will deliver formal notice to your general counsel by end of day. I'd recommend calling an emergency board meeting before the market opens tomorrow." Nobody in the room spoke. Nobody moved. Eleanor slid slowly down the wall behind her until she was sitting amid the wreckage of broken crystal, her perfectly composed face finally cracking apart, tears cutting through her makeup as the full weight of what she'd just lost settled over her. Not just a company, not just a fortune, but the entire foundation of an identity she had built on the unpaid labor and quiet mercy of a man she'd never bothered to truly see. Arthur didn't wait to watch her fall apart. He turned, walked past the frozen crowd of executives who parted for him without a word, and crossed the hall to where his son sat waiting. "Did you count all the lights?" he asked softly, crouching down. Leo nodded, sniffling. 42. "Good job, buddy." Arthur scooped him up into his arms, and Leo wrapped his small arms tightly around his father's neck, face pressed into his shoulder. "Let's go home." He carried his son out through the grand front doors of Holloway Tower, past the valets and the caterers setting up for a gala that would very likely never happen, out into the ordinary daylight of an ordinary morning, leaving behind him a shattered sculpture, a shattered company, and a woman on the floor who was only now, far too late, beginning to understand that the quietest man in the building had been the only reason any of it had existed at all. Arthur set Leo down on the sidewalk a block from the tower, crouching to zip up his son's jacket against the morning chill. "You hungry?" he asked. "I think this calls for pancakes." Leo's face lit up despite the tears still drying on his cheeks. "The place with the whipped cream?" "The place with the whipped cream," Arthur confirmed, taking his son's small hand in his own as they started down the street, away from the glass tower and everything it represented, toward whatever came next. He didn't know yet what shape his life would take now that 7 years of careful invisibility had come apart in the space of 10 minutes. There would be lawyers to call, decisions to make, a company's worth of people whose futures now depended on choices he hadn't wanted the responsibility of making. But none of that pressed on him as heavily as it might have. Not with his son's hand warm in his and a plate of pancakes waiting somewhere up ahead. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Arthur Pendleton walked down a public street without bothering to make himself smaller.